say the thumb should be on the side of the voter, not to pick on that phrase. You know, another way to sort of think about that is when we talk about democracy, well, it seems like you hear phrases like letting the people decide, right? Or, you know, it's the rule of the people, the voice of the people. But again, when you think about, when you listen to people making arguments for why there should be these restrictions, say some rule about some particular ID being necessary in order to exercise your right to vote, or whether there should be restrictions on early voting, right? These folks aren't saying just, hey, these are justified because even though they're undemocratic, they're going to lead to better outcomes in the long run because of the particular beliefs we have. And they might also think that, but they know they can't really say that out loud. Okay? They say, this is actually, we're defending democracy. So what I want to understand is, right, a little bit is in what sense do they think that they're defending democracy? And then what I want to do is ask, you know, just what I'm trying to do is get us to think a little bit about, well, why does democracy matter so much? So if both sides think they're defending democracy, but they're defending democracy in different ways, and they have a slightly different view maybe of, right, what steps should be taken to defend democracy, right? Which of those ways should we go? And I think to think about that question, we have to think about, again, these just big questions about why did democracy matter in the first place? We take democracy for granted, but who cares about democracy? What's so important about democracy? Right? Why does universal suffrage matter? Why does it have to be universal? Right? More specifically, what's the cost to all of us of someone voting on one side who does not have the right to vote? Right? Fraud. What's the cost to democracy if there being some fraud? On the other side, what's the cost of denying someone their right to vote? Right? To say society as a whole or to that individual in particular. And that's what we need to get at. And then I think then we're going to start to understand something about how the two sides are thinking about, right, how they evolve. The issue is how to balance maximizing access to the polls with minimizing voter fraud, right, when you're thinking about these issues and the way that they present the case. So, and I get it, a lot of this comes down to sort of an empirical question of how much fraud there actually is, okay, and maybe there isn't that much fraud, in which case it makes some of these arguments that are being put forward look pretty bad. But let's not focus here too much on the empirical stuff. Instead, let's ask this question. The question I want to focus on is sort of what it is to be defending democracy on these two different views. Somehow the integrity of the electoral process, the integrity of our democratic system, and how they're looking at it differently. Side note, I'm using the word democratic a lot, democracy a lot. I don't really want to have to define that term. It turns out it's very hard to define that term, but it's useful just to think about two different ideas and realize that they're both in the air, and you shouldn't feel like you should have a clear definition of democracy either, because no one really does. Or when somebody tries to present a definition of democracy, it ends up leaving out some views that historically would be counted as democratic views. And so, on one hand, people tend to identify democracy with a particular set of institutions, like elections. Right? You've got to have elections to have a democracy. On the other hand, people will identify democracy with a set of values. Typically something about maybe equality, right? Some kind of equal standing that people share some kind of, have some kind of equal standing. That then could be expressed in different kinds of institutions. In principle, you could have those values be expressed without having, say, elections. One model would be something like a lottery model, where everybody's views get represented equally. We all have our views, but the way our views get represented fairly is by selecting one from among us to represent us in a kind of lottery system. Arguably, that's democratic if you can show that it satisfies the kinds of values that people who are writing in the democratic tradition associate with democracy. So I basically just I don't want to get caught up too much on that issue, but when I'm thinking about democracy here, I'm thinking a little bit more about that kind of value picture. Okay, what I'm interested in is what kind of sort of rules should we have in place so that they do justice to certain kinds of core democratic value we have. And I'm going to focus on this idea of equal sort of political standing. And what occurs to me is that when you think about these debates about the people who want to have some of these voter restrictions and the people who are resisting these restrictions, okay, there's a kind of common statement that it seems like both views sort of are related to that is worth picking apart. Here's a claim that it seems like both sides would have to accept, at least in public. The claim is that all and only adult citizens who have not been legally disqualified for some other reason, like they're felons, should enjoy the rights associated with basic equal political standing. Here's the trick about that statement. It was the all and only bit. Right? So it seems like some people are focused on making sure that all people, all citizens who haven't been disqualified, get to enjoy those rights associated with equal political standing. And what's really important is to make sure that all of them, that everyone has access to the polls, everyone is able to participate, everyone is able to have that, exercise those rights. It strikes me that when I think about the people who are defending restrictions, they tend to focus a little bit more on the only part. They want to make sure that it's only people who are actually citizens that get to enjoy the rights associated with our basic equal political standing. The thought is then, though, there are going to be costs about going one way or another on this issue. Right? On one hand, if what you want to do is maximize participation, because you want to make sure all people get to enjoy those rights, you're going to end up with the possibility of including some people who don't actually have those rights. On the other hand, you might be, if you focus on the idea that it's only the people who have those rights ought to be able to exercise those rights, you might end up excluding some people who have those rights from actually getting to exercise those rights. But what you end up on that view is a kind of a purer picture in a certain narrow sense, that nobody is voting who doesn't have the right to vote. And that just might be very attractive to you. And I think it's very attractive to some of these people proposing these restrictions. But basically what I want to do here is suggest that if you're going to have these two basic ideas in place, that there ought to be a presumption in favoring the all bit rather than the only bit. Right? That if we're going to have, if in an uncertain world, right, and if we're going to have rules where there's going to be a presumption in one way or another, the presumption should be in favor of inclusion and participation, and not and not against the more exclusive view. Here's the core reason why. It seems to me, anyway, that there's an asymmetry. Let's take the idea of there being one voter who gets to vote who doesn't have the right to vote, versus there being one voter who is denied their right to vote even though they have the right to vote. And at least as it seems to me, it seems like one of those harms is worse than the other. Right? So that there's an asymmetry. The way I put it down here in my notes is the idea that I think the concentrated harm done to a particular individual citizen in denying her the vote is greater than I think the distributed harm done to all the other democratic citizens generally when a single individual votes who does not have the right to vote. So we're just imagine a one-for-one case. And the thought is something, again, just to put it in different words, is if somebody votes who doesn't have the right to vote, I'm not denying that there's a harm to the rest of us in some sense, There's even a harm to us in terms that I was putting in terms of equal political standing. Right? At some level, we each of us, now our voice is diminished in some respect by someone getting having a voice who shouldn't have a voice. But that I don't think compares to the harm of actually denying somebody their voice who has a right to have a voice. And I think if you accept that asymmetry, right, then it puts some of these restrictions, some of the arguments of the people promoting restrictions in a different light, that they have an extra burden. In fact, right, so what they would need to show is that actually there's enough, that there's enough fraud, right, such that it's actually creating a big enough harm that you're getting kind of the problems that we would relate in terms of the representation of these equal political, these individuals with equal political standing, right? That something special needs to be done. So it's not that you couldn't overcome the presumption; it's just a presumption. But the thought is that the presumption should be on the side of participation. Okay. Just because I want to make sure there's enough time for questions, let me just run through a few other things. So that's one kind of argument I want to say that just is sort of asymmetry thesis on the idea of a one versus one kind of case. But now let's step back to the stuff I was talking about at the beginning, which is just why did we care about democracy in the first place? And I'm just going to give you a very quick rundown of some of the reasons people care about democracy, why we want to have democracy. And I want to suggest that in each of these cases, it's important that we have greater participation with whatever those associated risks are, up to a limit, rather than less participation. So one of the things we care about democracy, right, I'm just telling you things you know, is we think a democracy, compared to some other systems of government, is going to be more responsive to the interests of the governed. But if you have a rule restricting access to voting, where that rule is going to disproportionately affect a certain socioeconomic or racial group, there's a very good chance that a whole set of interests are not going to be represented. And then you'll have a government that's not actually being very responsive to the interests of the government as a whole. That's an argument for more participation rather than less participation. That we're not going to have accountability in the right way. Okay? Here's a second argument. Sometimes people make the case that democracy actually is going to give us smarter government. It's not necessarily that we have all these, everyone serving in a democratic government is brilliant. But the thought is that because a democratic government is a government that has to take into account a diversity of viewpoints, it gets all these inputs from all these different places, whether through voting or through discussion and deliberation, right? It's an informed process, it's a self-correcting process, it's a process that gives us smart government. Again, if you're not getting all those inputs, then it's a threat to the mechanisms that make government smart, make democratic government smart government, if it is at all. Here's another argument for democracy that people have raised historically, that it actually helps all of you to develop as citizens, helps you to develop certain good characteristics that we want people to have. It gives you that democracy by allowing you to participate, it helps you develop a sense of the common good, a concern for other citizens, right? It broadens your horizons. It makes you think about things that are not just your self-interest. And by getting you to by having you involved in decision making, it helps foster your autonomy. You learn how to become a more autonomous thinking individual. Again, that's an argument for more participation rather than less participation. Frankly, also, I think people talk about democracy historically as one of its great virtues is that it allows for the peaceful transfer of power when you compare it to other systems of government. But again, and this is just if things got bad enough, if you're disenfranchising a certain segment of the population enough, then you threaten stability and you threaten peace. Two last considerations about democracy. One is when you ask a lot of people what's so great about democracy, a common answer these days is that, right, it's a fair process. This is all tied in with the idea of equal political standing, right, that we all have an equal voice. Now, we disagree on important matters in society, but what democracy does is it provides an institutional framework within which we can either compromise, depending on how you're thinking about it, come to consensus, come to some kind of agreement of terms that everyone can accept. It's an intrinsically fair procedure that respects that reasonable disagreement and respects us all as individuals. If you, again, disenfranchise groups by introducing rules that don't let them have access to the polls, say, you fail to, the process, the democracy loses its standing as a fair process, which is costly not just to individuals, but costly to everyone when we're thinking about the very legitimacy of government in the first place. And the last point I want to mention is that there's just, well, this relates to something I was just saying, but there's sort of an expressive point. Right? One thing about democracy, being in a democracy, is that it expresses something like solidarity. Right? One of the things people value about democracy is the fact that it involves us in taking up a kind of we perspective on things. Right? It's not just about me. I mean, depending on the view of democracy, it's not just about me. It's not just about you. For some people, what democracy is fundamentally about is community and solidarity, us appreciating that there's a decision we're all making together as a community. So there's a question about when the government is even taking seriously introducing restrictions that would really suppress the voice of a big part of the community. Right? Even if it's just 5% of the community or whatever, but whatever that's a big enough percentage, right? Then we lose that sense of ourselves as engaged in a we project, as in a project that expresses a kind of solidarity that seems to be inherently part of what people value about democracy. So that was just a very quick laundry list of things where I tried to make both an asymmetry thesis for creating a kind of presumption against these restrictions, but also just tried to say why I think in general, given the kinds of historical arguments in favor of democracy, reminding ourselves why this is a good thing, this project we're all engaged in, why we should be skeptical about these efforts to restrict voting. Thanks.
Thank you. So, all three of our speakers, please come up and join me here. We will take questions, and but we'll have a lively discussion, I'm sure. I guess I'll be the moderator, and I'll just start the phone.
Hi, first off, thank you. And my question is directed at the Kaji, or I'm sorry, who's your name?
That's
correct.
right.
You said it exactly.
Kaji?
Yes.
Okay, so, but, and feel free to jump in. I'm curious about something you said, the very first thing you said that we should be after the best constitution, and that there is progress in voting rights. I'm kind of wondering if this is implying that there is some normative weight to the way we think about a constitution, but also that there is in fact an end of government that we're after, and that there is a real direction that voting rights ought to move, and if so, is there a possible conflation between the moral justification, the political justification, and possibly the pragmatic justification given some kind of end of government?
Yeah. I'm really glad you picked up on both of those points, right? Both the point about the best constitution that it can be, and also the point about progress. And I guess my answer to your question is yes and yes, right? So let me, without taking up too much of your time, talk about how I think we ought to interpret the Constitution, at least the open-ended provisions of the Constitution, like equal protection and due process. And I'm cognizant as I talk about this that I'm among philosophers, at least some philosophers. And it's also, at least in part, where my background when I was an undergraduate lies. I think that when we think about this question, we need to think about it in a disinterested way. Thinking about a fair political structure that is fair to everyone, regardless of your wealth or poverty, and that we would regard as fair even if we didn't know exactly what positions we occupy. This is what Rawls referred to as the veil of ignorance. So yeah, there is, I'm glad you picked up on this, because you're sort of catching me on something. There are some normative presuppositions behind everything I say about the right to vote. And make no mistake about it, I'm making an argument about how I think the right to vote should be understood. I'm also basing it, to rely in part on Rawls, of whom I know Professor Bernstein is a scholar, so I'm going to be careful not to say anything
I got your back.
that is, yeah, great, that she's going to call me on. You know, I think the idea of consensus is important here, and that there is now, even though there wasn't at the founding of this country, as illustrated by Adams, who Dr. Gunn spoke of, there is now a consensus on this idea, which I use the shorthand, one person, one vote for, that we should all be equal, regardless of our where we come from, regardless of our race, regardless of how much change we have jingling in our pocket. All of our interests in a democracy are entitled to equal weight, and that is not the democracy we have now. I do think that there is at least a wide degree of consensus on this ideal of equality now, even though there wasn't at the founding.
But we've been talking about the value of the individual. We live in a democratic but capitalistic system. There could also be democracy and socialism, I suppose. I have recently retired, and I don't feel that I am as much value now because I'm not productive. And it seems as if much of our country, and perhaps the people that are working on these restrictions, believe that the more productive I am in terms of change in my pocket, the more valuable I am. Would someone comment on that sense of individual value?
I don't have anything very systematic to say, but I will say that I for a couple of years worked at a conservative think tank, and one of the things I noticed while I was there was how consistently people there didn't refer to citizens but referred to taxpayers. that was their word for citizen was tax. Where you and I might say citizen, they said taxpayer. It really struck me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let me just comment briefly on this. I mean, I do think, back to the consensus point, look, if someone really believes that someone's vote or someone's voice really deserves more weight because they have more income or wealth, you and I are not going to have too much to say to each other, or that person and I are not going to have too much to say. That's, it's just, there are certain basic principles that we're not in agreement on. And I do think, as the Adams quote exemplifies, that kind of thinking was common at the founding of this country. I have to say, it's part of the reason why I'm not an originalist when it comes to interpreting the Constitution. I think it's wrong, and I actually think there's a broad consensus, maybe not universal, but there's a broad public consensus that that view is wrong today, even though I recognize there are some people who do think people deserve more weight in a democracy by virtue of their greater wealth.
Talking a lot about democracy, political representation, but from the beginning of our current Constitution, we have this problem where A senator in California represents 18 million people. In Ohio, about 6 million people. And Wyoming, about 250,000 people. And one person, one vote is like a joke. When I think about being politically equal, you know, the Senate in some ways has more power than the House. I don't know if anybody wants to talk about that. The other issue I was going to bring up is we talked, I forget which one of you said, well, if you're not allowed to vote, prisoners, felons, and I can't understand why they're not allowed to vote. If they're in prison, fine, they still should be allowed to vote. If have served their time, certainly they should be allowed to vote. But both of those issues.
Yeah, I'll let you take the vote. I don't know whether you had an opportunity to hear Dr. Michelle Alexander, which you spoke on our campus
Yes.
last year. I think that she addresses that very well in her book, The
Yes.
New Jim Crow. And essentially the same type of voter suppression that occurred after the Reconstruction period, when African American men were arrested on the flimsiest of excuses and then carted off to work for free as part of an arrangement between the police forces in the southern states and the farmers who still wanted free labor. They were subsequently deprived as well of their votes. And she's suggesting in her book, or not suggesting, she's saying in her book, that what we have now with the continuous arrest of African American men and boys for the flimsiest of excuses and the type of disparate sentencing that they receive, that this is comparable to the new Jim Crow. There are many people throughout the country who agree with you entirely that once a person has served his or her sentence, they've paid their debt to society and that they should be re-enfranchised. And there are some states that are beginning to pass those laws. In terms of your first question, it's probably more of a philosophical question, but to the extent that there are two houses and we have a bicameral legislature, we have every state having two representatives. That's what the founding fathers came up with. You have two senators. The equality is supposed to come in terms of the representation in the House of Representatives, where that's based upon the decennial, the every 10-year census, which determines what the population is in a given state. And so those were supposed to balance each other out. But you're going back to a philosophical question that none of us can change, because essentially the founding fathers didn't necessarily trust the hoi polloi. We would have been considered the hoi polloi. And they thought the House of Representatives needed to be carefully monitored by the Senate. So that's a question beyond which I'm not really certain that we can answer.
The Senate was modeled after the House of Lords, and we know what Great Britain has done now.
Yeah.
They've taken the House of Lords out of it to a large extent.
Right.
And why can't we, on one side? On the other, I would go even further. Being in prison should not be a reason for losing your right to vote, in my opinion. You're in prison, but your right to vote is a completely different sphere.
Was that considered part of the punishment, or what would you know the thinking behind that?
I think that if you look at the 15th Amendment that allowed people to vote,
Well, the 14th Amendment has either Section 2, which expressly refers to, and by some people's interpretation, allows states to deny the vote to people who commit crimes. I'm sorry, Kate.
and that's quite right. Under the 15th Amendment, if you look at slavery and peonage having been abolished, then essentially you're saying that you don't have free workers anymore. And if you tie that in with the 14th Amendment, which, as Professor Takai suggests, actually allowed people under certain circumstances to have their votes excluded,
than if you could create a whole section of people, like hundreds of thousands of people who had just gotten the vote and said, now you've been arrested, you can't vote anymore. It seems to me that it was a deliberate choice that was made by people who wanted to disenfranchise people whom they didn't want to have political power anymore, and also whom they wanted to take out of the economic sphere and to have free labor all over again.
But there's also an old view that is that people, I mean, I don't hold to it, that just as people who are not productive members of society should be able to have a say over how that society goes. And so it's not just felons, or people actually in prison, but people who are, you know, in the 19th century, people thought people who were on the dole, you know, getting government support, shouldn't have a vote. And that the intuition there is just, if you're not contributing and you're more of a taker than a giver, then you shouldn't have a say. I mean, I'm not defending it, but I think that was a kind of a view.
One thing I'd like to mention in connection with that is the thought that people who are imprisoned, who subsequently cannot vote, do not have that very important way of expressing their views and employing their modicum of political power to bring about reform of the very institutions that imprison them. And that allows a great deal of power to be exercised over people who are powerless, not only in being deprived of their votes, but in many other ways. And that brings us to another topic which I won't digress on, but which is also relevant here, which is the increasing privatization of America's prisons.
I wanted to comment about setting up districts, which you've all alluded to. Here in Athens County, we have someone I've known for many years, namely David Horn, who has worked for years and years to bring citizens more into the process of determining electoral districts. And in 2010, after 2010, I thought it was very interesting that there was a Midwest coalition sort of thing where people were encouraged to set up districts with the necessary requirements, for compactness and not dividing up the various counties and that sort of thing. And they had a contest for that, which was open to all the people in these Midwest, I guess, basically. And it came out something like there were about 250 people who gave this a try and set up districts, potential districts in the state of Ohio, as an example. Well, when the official districting was announced, it was obvious that the official districting was less fair than any one of the 250 proposals that had come in from citizens, because of the necessity for the political party in charge to draw the districts. And I'm not just blaming Republicans, because I've lived here a long time, and the Democrats certainly carved up districts their way when they were the ones in power.
Let me respond to this, since I was a member of the group that you mentioned that conducted this competition, the Ohio Coalition for Accountable Redistricting, and was actually one of the judges of this competition. There were somewhat fewer submissions than you mentioned, but you're absolutely right. We scored them all on a number of criteria: competitiveness, representational fairness to both parties, that is, compactness and keeping communities, including municipalities and counties, together. The plan that we have in place, a portion of which I put up earlier, scored the worst by far among all of the plans, and scored worse than many of them in each of these 4 criteria. I mean, there are inevitably some trade-offs among these different interests and when you come to redistricting, but there's no way of justifying the districts that we have now. I was also part of the campaign to pass issue 2 a few years ago, which would have created an independent redistricting commission and established these 4 criteria that that commission should follow. We got creamed at the polls, right? And you know, I think to put it in a nutshell, we got creamed. Not if I could explain this issue to every Ohio voter in even if I just had 2 minutes, there's no question that the vast majority would support it. But most voters just don't understand redistricting, and it's easy to confuse them. And if people are confused, they vote no. And the other side, let me give them credit, was very effective in confusing voters into voting no. You know, why don't I do that in Q&A? I don't want to take up any more time than I have, if that's, or you know, with people afterwards if you have more questions.
I have a question about, we were talking about the epistemic justification for democracy and how even if we hold that view, it seems like we're going to want to put the presumption in the favor of including everybody, right? You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Okay. So my question is, I'm a little concerned though, because it's unclear that the goal is really just, I know we want to include all situated knowledge when we're answering questions that's in our political community, and this is why we think voting is going to have our democracy get the best answers, but that can't just be unqualified, right? It can't be the case that just, you know, that's the only goal, is getting the right answers by as much participation as possible, right? So it becomes unclear, well then, what really is the right way of demarcating membership?
So I'm not trying to cut the last bit, but let me just say that you're right that that's not the only thing you should be concerned with.
Sure.
But so there's a set, so like in the laundry list of things that democratic theorists have been concerned with, some of those had to do with the intrinsic value of democracy, certain kind of moral considerations. So the epistemic argument is just one that you might be concerned with. Now, whether or not, whether or not democracy actually has those epistemic benefits and what form of democracy is another question.
Yeah, it just seems weird to say, well, even on the epistemic view, you know, they want to put the presumption in the favor of including everybody, because the more the merrier, this is going to get us the best answers, but without qualification.
Right, so it's a good question. I think at some fundamental level, though, so I think you could try to make that case, and it wouldn't be totally implausible to make the case that some kind of competence, say, could be required among citizens. And people have tried to make the argument that if you're going to restrict voting rights, you know, one way you could arguably try to make the restriction is on the basis of some kind of competence claim. The problem is about trying to, so even if you could try to make that case in principle, we have good historical reasons to be worried about introducing any kind of restriction and how those introduction of restrictions would be used politically. Okay, and so I'm very skeptical about just introducing that, even if in principle you could see how it might make for a better discussion, a better democratic check. Assuming that the people who were deemed competent, you know, somehow passing some kind of test or being better educated or something like that, it did in fact still represent all of the interests in society somehow. But the argument that people make, whether you agree with it or not, is that as soon as you would introduce some kind of competence test, you would inevitably be leaving out certain sets of interests that also need to have a voice. Not just to have a check on government for that reason, but for epistemic reasons, so that we really understand what the interests of those people are and that they have an input into the process. So I'm not saying it can't be resisted, but that's the kind of claim.
So that's a response that can be made with regard to the epistemic argument. But of course, as you mentioned, there are the many other arguments in favor of democratic society,
including, among others, relations of mutual respect among persons equally entitled to mutual respect. There's one last question before, we're a little over time, but I'll take that last question in the back.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, you all spoke about who these voter restriction laws target, but why do you believe they are targeting poor or underclass people?
Yeah.
And if these are laws only in certain states, if it's such a problem, why haven't the national government just said, shut everything down, everyone is equal and they can all vote? Why do you believe that the national government hasn't stepped in yet?
Great question. So let me talk about what I think the ultimate motivation behind these laws are first, and then why the federal government hasn't stepped in. I think it's all about partisan politics, to be honest with you. You know, when someone tries to make it more difficult for a particular group of people to vote, well, we have to wonder. We have reasons to be suspicious that they may have some ulterior motive. And, you know, I certainly don't quarrel with what Pierce said earlier, that, you know, voter fraud is a legitimate concern. But my take on this is that because we have reasons to be suspicious about partisan manipulation of the voting rules, because we have reason to be suspicious in particular that one party is enacting certain laws over the other party's objection to make it more difficult for the other party's voters to vote, the thumb should, as I said, be on the scale of the voter. Not for the theoretical reason. I mean, I don't disagree with Pierce's theoretical arguments, but even if you don't buy those arguments, the thumb should be on the scale of the voter because we have reason to be suspicious, and the state should at least be forced to come up with evidence, with an empirical justification that these restrictions are really needed. So I think partisan manipulation is really what's at the heart of at least many of these laws. And then let me just respond to the second part. Why hasn't Congress enacted? You know, because almost nothing can get done in Congress without both parties agreeing. I've actually proposed a deal, right, where we have a liberalization of voter registration rules, which Democrats would love, in exchange for some reasonable voter identification requirements. I think this is something that both parties should be willing to accept, but you know, it's hard to get a grand bargain on anything, let alone things affecting elections in Congress these days.
I just wanted to add what may be obvious to everybody, but I may not. I think it's worth repeating that among the simple reasons why the laws restricting days and hours on which people can vote disproportionately affect the poor, and thus disproportionately affect ethnic and racial minorities, which are disproportionately among the poor, is that many of the poor people are actually working very low-paying jobs for long hours, or working several jobs, maybe working also 7 days a week. Just simply do not have the free time to go to the polls. Cannot afford to take time off from work, cannot afford to risk getting fired. Is this consistent with your understanding?
Yeah,
Okay.
I think it's a fair reflection of what the evidence in the cases that I mentioned has shown.
And I would add, if there were a true national consensus that everyone should be allowed to vote, and I think that most people think there is, again, if we could strike that grand bargain with Congress, we would have voting on Saturday and Sunday, or we might have voting that would extend an entire week. We would have mandatory voting as opposed to having voluntary voting. Everyone would be required to vote. Whom they voted for would still be up to them. But there are many parts of the world, many of our Democratic colleagues in other parts of the world, who in fact have voting that actually is far more expansive and that is designed intentionally to make certain that the vast majority of people within their democracies are given that sacred opportunity.
here I think there just is a disconnect between what the politicians are willing to do and what the consensus actually is among people. I mean, I think right after the 2000 election, there was a Federal Election Commission co-chaired by Presidents Ford and Carter that made a lot of very sensible recommendations. I don't know if you agree with that, but some of the things, including saying allowing the felons should be able to vote, but it just died, that proposal. But it was bipartisan. It represented a kind of effort at consensus, but it didn't go anywhere.
Well, some of it got enacted into law in the form of the Help America Vote Act, but other parts of it weren't enacted.
Yeah.
I recently received an email from the ACLU, I believe, saying that in the state of Ohio, felons can vote. Now, I'm not the lawyer here, but I believe that that's the case, and if anybody wants to check, go to the website of the ACLU and see what you can find out about rights
That's
for
true, and
felons.
there was also very recently a decision that came down from a federal court, which says that people who have been jailed but haven't been convicted yet are entitled to vote during the period that they've been jailed but not found guilty of any charges. And so the Secretary of State is not too happy about this ruling. It's going to require him to actually go into jails and provide opportunities for people to vote in a few days before the election.
Secretary of State of the state of
Ohio.
Ohio. I just wanted to also add that although many people might think, well, it can't be a good idea for felons or any criminals or anybody jailed to vote. But think of the fact that many people are wrongly imprisoned. Laws can be unjust. People can be imprisoned under unjust laws. If people are imprisoned wrongly or under unjust laws and therefore lose their right to vote, the ability for people in power who are deploying it unjustly to consolidate their power and to make things more unjust is increased. Dan?
Yeah, I have a question about something that I got in the mail from Secretary Huston. The voter absentee voter thing. And I'm wondering, because I have some questions about it, if you could talk a little bit about what it used to be like before we had a secretary who seems to be very intent on making sure people don't cheat. But there seem to be a couple of parts of this letter. First of all, it says do not forward, which seems to be an attempt to make sure that people who are not at the address that they're registered at don't get, people who move around frequently. I'm a teacher and my kids move around frequently in this county. But it also says here, the very first line, it says, in the Buckeye State we make it in capital letters, easy to vote, and also in capital letters, hard to cheat. And then it says, whoever commits election falsification is guilty of a felony of the fifth degree. Could you talk a little bit about the kind of language that makes it seem as if, first of all, it's very confusing. This whole thing is kind of confusing. And has it always been so confusing, or is it being made more confusing?
Well, I'm not sure if it's being made more confusing. Let me give you a little background on this. There's a long-standing dispute here about sending out what I think is an absentee ballot application through the mail, right? And generally speaking, Democrats have wanted this, and Republicans have been more resistant in the past. Some county boards of election have sent out these applications on their own. The Ohio legislature passed a law prohibiting them from doing that and allowing these only if funding is provided by the Ohio legislature for them, which at least for this election cycle it has, which is why I think everybody in Ohio has received these absentee ballot applications. The Secretary of State's position has to be uniform. In other words, it's a problem if we do this in some counties,
but not others. You know, and let me just say this, in defense of the Secretary of State, I disagree with him on a number of things, but I think it's a good thing that these letters, these absentee ballot applications are going out, and that they're going out to everybody across the state. I think that is a good thing. There are a lot of folks in the Republican Party who, to be quite honest with you, have exaggerated the threat of fraud in order to justify restrictions on voting. Personally, I don't think that Secretary of State Husted is worst among that group. I mean, others may disagree with me. Some of my friends in the Democratic Party think he's the worst thing that's ever come along. Apparently, they don't remember Ken Blackwell.
Could you go talk a little bit about the language?
Yeah.
Because it just does seem like the language is
Yeah.
meant to scare people into not, you know, oh my God, do I still live at the same address that I did 4 years ago, or that kind of stuff.
I mean, maybe so, but it's an accurate statement of Ohio law.
In the second sentence, though, it's put right up top.
I get that.
I think well, I said I was going to take one more question, and that was several questions ago. It's past 6:30. Thank you all for staying. Thank you for the operators of the cameras for staying. Anybody who still wants to stick around and talk a little, you're welcome to stay for a few more minutes. I feel like I have to let the camera people go. Thank you all for coming.